Hello, my name is Tracy Stuntz. I work as an instructional designer at Clovis Community College in California. This presentation is going to focus on backward design, objectives, and universal design for learning, not in a way that is going to make you an expert in any of those subjects, but enough so that you will be able to either create a module for a course or revise an existing module based on the principles of backward design. Specifically, what we're going to do is by the end of this presentation, you will be able to explain the components of backward design, write a student-centered unit level objective, align that objective with assessments and content for your unit, and then revise one existing unit in your course. This presentation also includes a handout. If you would like to follow along, I will be identifying areas during the presentation in which you can pause and complete the prompts on the handout. The idea is once the handout is complete, you will have all of the things you need to be able to put together your module. If you would rather just listen, that is also fine. Just don't pause the video when I indicate that it's time to fill out your handout. So if you're starting with your handout, the first question asks which course you have chosen to work on for this presentation. So you're able to fill that in now. We're going to first start by talking a little bit about backward design. And backward design is just as it sounds, designing backwards. So rather than starting with the content for the class and then working towards the quiz or the paper, whatever the assessment you have for your students, you're actually going to start with that idea, behavior, or task you want your students to be able to complete and work backwards in creating the content for that unit. Oftentimes, when I see faculty's courses who have started to add unit level objectives, or they're starting to put together learning modules in their online class, what happens is when you work starting with the content and move toward the assessment, sometimes your content and your assessment aren't aligned. And so you may be giving them content that is not helping them to successfully complete the assessment, either because the content is too advanced for what the assessment is asking, or the content may be too basic for what the assessment is asking. For example, if you have a PowerPoint, I've seen in courses PowerPoints that are mostly vocabulary terms and definitions from the chapter, and then the assessment wants the students to analyze something. And they're missing some instruction between those two things, that just by seeing the definitions and the vocabulary isn't going to give them the tools they're going to need at the end to be able to analyze something that successfully. So in backward design, what we're doing is we're going to start with the behavior, the specific behavior we want our students to be able to do when the module or the unit is over, and then work backwards And from that, creating the assessment and then creating the content. So that way, by the time we get to our content, we can be pretty confident that it is connected to the assessment that we had. So specifically, what we're going to do is we're going to identify an objective. This is that behavior we want our learners to be able to do at the end of the unit. We're going to looking at that objective, think about what type of task is going to show us that the students are able to do that thing or have that behavior. And we're going to use that idea to create an assessment out of that. And then from the assessment, we're going to plan our instruction for the unit. And so we'll add our lecture content, exercises, activities, any supplemental materials that your students are going to need in order to be successful in that assessment. And the other great part about this is that then you have unit objectives that you can share with your students at the beginning of the unit. And so your students know going into the unit what it is that they're going to be expected to learn or be able to do as a result of that unit. And they can, kind of keep that in the back of their minds as they are going through the unit content. So now, if you're following along with the worksheet, the second question on the worksheet asks, during this specific unit in your class, I want students to be able to do this. And so you can write down, what it is your behavior or your task, or even if it's still kind of more informal and it's just, in concept language, that's also fine. So now that we understand the concepts of backward design, we're going to move on to creating unit objectives. So unit objectives are smaller even than our course objectives and much smaller than our student learning outcomes for the course. So student learning outcomes are the biggest for a course. They're going to be maybe more broadly written, and it's going to be at the end of the course what you want your students to be able to do. When we move down to course objectives, those are the things your students are going to be doing in order to fulfill our learning outcomes. And then moving even smaller into unit objectives, these are the things that our students are going to be doing within that unit. And so whether it's just a week or 2 weeks, it's just that small period of time that you want to be able to tell your students what it is that they'll be able to do. So a good learning objective contains an action verb, is measurable, reflects the content and the assessment of the unit, and is student-centered. So we're going to go over each one of those. So contains an action verb is something that the students are going to be doing. So it's not something that is going to happen to them, but rather something that they are going to be doing as a result of going through the content and the activities of the unit. With measurable, you want to make sure that it's something you'll be able to know when they've actually completed. And I have a few examples on the next slide that'll go over some verbs that are kind of popular but might not necessarily be measurable. If you're looking for more information on this, Bloom's taxonomy is a really great resource, but it is something that you'll still have to look through and think about critically. Not all of the verbs that are listed in Bloom's taxonomy type worksheets are going to be usable or workable for your specific class, but it is a good place to get started. With our third point, reflects the content in the assessment of the unit, we're going to have this because we're working backward in creating our assessment and content after we've already identified our objective. So this one's going to be done for us. And then finally, it's going to be student-centered. So student-centered objectives focus on what the student is going to be doing, not what the instructor is going to do to them. And so I'll show you my examples. These are not great examples. So I wanted to trick you for a minute, but I'll start with our poorly written examples. And this is what I see a lot when instructors are thinking about creating unit level objectives, is they mistake the objectives from what the to-do list would be. So read Unit 1 in your textbook is an action item. It's not an objective. So you'll want to think about what it is in their reading that you want them to learn or be able to explain or compare and contrast or discuss or whatever it is you want them to do with the content after they've read in their textbook. You can still choose to have a to-do list. It's just not going to be, that's not taking the place of your objectives. Now, the second one might look kind of good. Develop an understanding of the conventions of business etiquette. And this is a kind of a popular one that I've seen, but understanding isn't really a measurable verb. And so some faculty think that they can measure students' understanding with multiple choice type quizzes or having them fill out a worksheet or whatnot, but those are actually other behaviors that are being demonstrated. And there's not really a way to measure whether or not a student is actually understanding. So you'll want to be a little bit more specific in what you're looking for if you're choosing something like that in your objectives. And then finally, learn about the Civil War. So this one is one that is written more teacher-centered, and it has that unmeasurable verb still. So learn is kind of in that same boat as understanding, where you can't really tell if a student has learned. You can do it to them and try to get them to learn, but there's not really a measurable way to see learn. And then this is also written from the perspective of what the teacher is doing. The teacher will be lecturing or providing content about the Civil War with the hopes that the student will then learn about the Civil War. But it's not written in a student-centered manner. These are ones that are a little bit better. So describe the history of the American criminal justice system. This is describe is something that you can see the student do. It's a behavior that is measurable, and it is written in the way that is the behavior the students are going to be doing. So theoretically with this, they will be participating in a discussion board or completing some sort of journal activity or whatever the assessment is, but that you as the instructor will be able to see that they have indeed described. The second one, identify elements of editing, including composition, setting, and lighting, also has that identify, and then it's written in the action that the students are going to be doing. They are going to be identifying elements. They're not going to be, you are not going to be covering elements of editing, including composition, setting, and lighting, which would be more student-centered or more teacher-centered in the objective. So again, if you're following along on your worksheet, your third blank asks you to write an objective for your specific unit. And so thinking about creating, we can go back, creating something that is an action verb, is measurable, it will reflect the content and assessment of the unit, but that it is indeed student-centered in its language. So the second step in backward design is then turning our objective then into the assessment for the assignment or for that unit. And so there are two types of assessments. Formative assessments just help to monitor the students' learning and let you provide feedback to them. These types of assessments are maybe no points or really low points. Low risk is another term that they call these assessments. What they do is they help students to know like what areas that they have strengths in and what areas they have weaknesses in. Maybe something they thought that they had understood from the content, but are now realizing that they didn't. And then also, it helps you as the instructor identify where the students are struggling. And so, if you notice that your students are constantly missing a reading quiz question, maybe that particular content isn't being covered as well, and you can adjust. So, you'll want to have a variety of formative assessments in your course because these are essentially just kind of check in things. But where our objectives are going to um, align to more are our summative assessments. And these are things that are going to help you really evaluate whether or not the student has achieved the objective that you had. These are more high stakes. That does not necessarily mean that they're going to be all worth 100 points or whatnot, but they're things that are going to have an impact on the student grade. So if you say have your formative assessments being 5 points, then something that's like 20 points might be a little bit of a higher summative assessment. And it won't necessarily have to be like the paper for the course or the course major assignment, but it can be a summative assessment for that unit. And so that can be your discussion board where you're actually evaluating students' ability to discuss, or it can be a test where you're looking at if they know the definitions of something, or what it is that you're actually trying to get them to be able to accomplish at the end of that unit. So with this one, we have our next two questions in our handout. I'm sorry, just the next one question in our handout. The assessment that will show that behavior is. And so you'll want to really think about the action verb of your objective and then what your assessment can measure. Again, I shared that disconnect between wanting students to analyze, but then maybe having an assessment that is a multiple choice test. These are things that multiple choice quiz maybe can measure if a student can analyze, but really wouldn't be the best measure of that. And so you'll want to think about the types of assessments you have in your course and what it is they're actually measuring, and then how that connects to the objectives that we've created. Here's a second way of looking at it. This is the way that you are kind of thinking about your outcomes in your assessment together. And this is this idea of alignment that I have been talking about for the last part of this presentation. So when you are aligning your assessments, what you're doing is you're making sure the assessment is going to be the thing that proves to you the student has achieved the outcome. So if your assessments are indeed misaligned, you might not be able to, or you might be falsely identifying whether or not your students have completed that objective. So again, just kind of take some time to think about making sure the assessment that you're creating for this third to last question on your worksheet is something that might actually be able to prove that the behavior of the objective that you've created is there. And finally, we're going to move on to from there, creating content. So the next question on your worksheet asks, to help students be successful in that assessment, this content needs to be covered. And so this is where you're going to start to identify the things in your lecture materials or activities or whatnot that is going to help your students be successful in that objective or in that assessment, which then measures the objective. So one thing to add on is this idea of universal design for learning. And universal design for learning is a pedagogical theory that helps all students because what it does is it gives them multiple opportunities to show their strengths and downplay their weaknesses. There are a lot of other, probably more in depth and better resources for universal design for learning. If you want to know more about this after the presentation, this is going to be a very, very brief overview. So a key component of universal design is this idea of multiple means. Because remember, we want our students to be able to highlight all of their strengths and downplay their weaknesses. And so if a student is really great at reading, but cannot watch a video to save their lives, and this is actually me, so it's a real student that does exist, I realize, then having the lecture content in both forms is going to help that student be successful. Whereas you might have a student who's the opposite, is having a hard time understanding the reading, but will totally get it if they watch a video of you explaining it or a video that has already been created of an explanation. And again, by having both forms, you're allowing both of those students to be successful using their strengths. The one student being able to use the reading, the other student being able to see the video. So specifically, when we're looking at multiple means, we want to look at multiple means of representation, multiple means of action and expression, and multiple means of engagement. So multiple means of representation focuses on the ways in which your students are going to be engaging with your, or not engaging, because that's the last one. That was a poor verb to use in that. But it's going to be focusing on multiple ways in which your students are going to be interacting with your content. And so this would be similar to the example that I shared earlier with the reading and the video. You're sharing both types of content where they share the same information, but it's just given to the students multiple times in multiple ways. Multiple means of action and expression are then helping our students with actions, with planning and organizing, how they are starting to complete the assessments for the different types of content that we have in our class. So this is going to help our students, say maybe we have some poor test takers, but we only have tests to measure our objectives in our course. And so we have a student who is unable to um, show their strength. Maybe they really can complete that objective, they just can't do it within that medium. So then maybe we have, a discussion board one week. Maybe then the next week you allow them to do an alternative discussion board. There's a lot of free options out there that are really great for online classes, that something like Padlet, and I don't want to highlight anyone over the other, but something like that is really interesting because it allows the students to respond in a variety of media. And so they can choose to type in a response, they can record a video, they can add a website, they can, put in a presentation of sorts. And so it kind of lets them respond in the way that highlights their strength, rather than forcing them to just kind of type out discussion board responses week after week or taking quizzes week after week. So you want to think about giving your students multiple ways to show you that they have fulfilled the objective. And then finally, multiple means of engagement. This one's focused on how we can help our students stay motivated in the class. And so if you are using the same types of examples or the same types of not allowing the students to, not giving them feedback or not allowing them to identify the goals that they have, you're going to prevent them from having this multiple means of engagement, for feeling excited or interested in what is going on in the class. A great way to do this is just by asking the students to connect what the content is to something that's going on in the real world or in their lives, and then allowing students to give input periodically within the class, and then making those adjustments when students can see that they have told you they're having trouble with all of the reading, and so then for the next week you've made a video in addition to the reading. That's going to help them stay motivated because it's showing that you're caring for them in that way. So for our last question on our worksheet, we're going to fill in, here are some alternate ways this content can be covered. And you're going to think about the things that you identified in the previous question, and maybe you've always just done a PowerPoint, or you've always done a lecture video, or it's always just reading from the textbook. So thinking about other ways that you can cover that content. You can certainly read more too into active learning strategies. Those are really popular and can be really engaging for students because it forces them to take more control of their learning. So this worksheet and this presentation is available if you want to come back and review it and continue to use the worksheet to identify other modules in your class and revise them, or as you're creating new modules for your class. So I thank you. I realize this was a really, really broad overview of these three topics, but I hope that you were able to get through revising, having the content to be able to revise your module. Thank you.